Okay, here we go. We are going through the Bible, 230 miles an hour, 30,000 feet, however you want to look at it. We're making progress. We're, almost halfway through, somewhere thereabouts. And sometimes we do a lot of chapters, sometimes we bog down in a chapter. Just trying to hit the important parts, the big parts, and trying to get the overall picture. So we just finished what was known as the history section of the Old Testament. Various kinds of books in the Bible, prophetic books, biography, poetry. And what we have, the Old Testament structure so far, is the first 5 books of the Bible, Moses. And then we get into the history books. We get into 12 of them. We begin with Joshua, and it goes into Judges, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel. That begins the period of the kings. Prior to that, the only king that they had was God. So that's the period of the kings, where we find King Saul, the first earthly king, and then King David, the second earthly king. And then at the end of those books, we get the transition. It goes into King Solomon, who is David's son. And so you get 1st Kings and 2nd Kings, and what happens after Solomon dies is the kingdom splits in half, and it becomes a big problem. There's a civil war. It starts to get very, very confusing because you have 10 of the 12 tribes in the north, and you have 2 of the tribes in the south. So a bit difficult to follow what goes on, but that's the period of the kings. And we looked at that history, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now it's the prophets are starting to try to guide the nation, and very often the prophets are trying to guide the kings. So keep that in mind when we get to the prophets, that they're trying to guide the nation, they're trying to guide the kings, living in a time of kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And so we find those books, and then we also find the other history books, because what happened was that those northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, they were disintegrating. They were losing their foundation as a nation because of their immorality and their idolatry. They were just falling apart. Everything was becoming a mess. And so they were overtaken militarily by the Assyrians. 150 years later, prior to that, the Babylonians come and conquer the Assyrians. The Assyrians are this sort of world governing empire. And then Babylon comes and conquers Assyria. So they become the new world governing empire. So during the Babylonian time, 150 years after the northern kingdom fell, the southern kingdom falls, and they export them to Babylon. While they're in Babylon, another world governing empire arises, Persia, and conquers Babylon. So those Jewish people that were exported to Babylon, exiled to Babylon, if they're still there, then now they're under Persian rule. And so they start to come back after 70 years, just like it said in the book of Jeremiah. 160 years earlier, Isaiah said there would be someone named Cyrus that would let them go back. All of these prophecies, 160 years and then 70 years with Jeremiah, amazing prophecies. They go back into the land, but it's a mess. They're just sort of trickling back. Ezra brings back 50,000 of them, and they start some sacrifices and then build a temple. And then we have the book of Nehemiah, where Nehemiah hears about what's going on, and he goes and he rebuilds the walls. And then we have the book of Esther, who was saved the Jewish people, because anti-Semitism has always been an issue. And there's always been a movement to kill the Jews right from the very beginning, always trying to destroy the family line of Abraham, which is the family line of Jesus. And that continues to this day, where anti-Semitism, being against the Jewish people, has always existed. And if you remember, there was also another attempt in the scriptures to get rid of this family tree of the Jewish people, this family tree of Jesus. And that was when King Herod, when Jesus was born, Herod had heard there was a king, and he wanted to extinguish all of these Jewish boys. And so there you have that. So now we are moving into a new section of books, but keep in mind, it's not chronological. So we're going to try to figure out this stuff because it's not chronological. So it's going to be hard to put some of this stuff in there, because we're moving now into what are known as the poetry books. And the poetry books begin with the book of Job. and then they move to the book of Psalms, and then they move to the book of Proverbs, and then they move to the book of Song of Solomon. So we have these books of prophecy. I'm sorry, we have these books of poetry, and then the book of Ecclesiastes. So there's 5 of them, and they're written at various times because one of the Psalms is written by Moses. So it goes all the way back to them. Most of the Psalms, if you were to attribute them to one person, they would have to be attributed to King David. So what we're going to find out about Jewish poetry is it's not like our poetry. It's not, our poetry likes to have meter, right? Where it's moving along in such a way that, it's sort of musical almost, right? Methodical meter. Well, with them, meter isn't the big issue. For them, it comes in couplets very often. And those couplets often will be a sentence, call it a sentence, and then the next sentence reinforces that sentence. An awful lot of that will happen in the Proverbs, an awful lot of that will happen in the Psalms. So you have a sentence and then you have another reinforcing sentence. Well, it also could be that you have a sentence and then you have a contrasting sentence. And we'll see that as we go on. We'll see the structure of their poetry, how it goes, and what the makeup of it is. Also, in a lot of the poetry, particularly the Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, it's also a minimizing of words. They're not going to use a lot of words, although Job is more sort of narrative, but it falls into that category of what we call poetry. So a little different than our poetry. There's 5 of them. We'll be looking at them. Again, Job dealing with the whole issue of suffering and God and evil and why do good people suffer. And we're going to go through 42 chapters of that, but we won't be going through every chapter, but we'll be summarizing it and going through it and trying to figure out what's going on in that book. And then we'll go into the Psalms. We'll spend a little bit of time in the Psalms because the Psalms are divided into different books. And there's a reason that the Psalms are divided into different books. They're the songbook of Israel. They would use the Psalms in order to sing in their seasons and in their temple and in their religious gatherings. And Psalm 119, young children would learn it, and we'll be amazed to see how long Psalm 119 is, but children would memorize it. Proverbs, just sort of wisdom, how to live on earth, and the best way to live a successful life and a prosperous life and a peaceful life, Proverbs. And that will be done really in strict Hebrew poetic form, where it will be a lot of coupling, either a line and then a reinforcing line, or a line and then a contrasting line. But sometimes you'll see a couple of couples and then a couple of contrasts. So it'll be fun. We'll point that out when we get there. Another book of Solomon. Solomon writes a lot of the poetry books. Song of Solomon, which is all about love, about human love. And some people say that the Song of Solomon is about the love relationship between Christ and the church. Well, we'll explore that when we get there. We'll spend a little bit of time in the Song of Solomon. And then it gets to the book of Ecclesiastes, where Solomon is really seeing things from only an earthly perspective. It's sort of a philosophical book. It falls into the category of what we call the poetry books, and it's structured like the poetry books would be structured, but very philosophical, asking, questions about life and the good life and what is the good life and how do you accomplish that and what are we here for and what should we be doing. So those will be those books. There'll be 5 of them. So remember, there's the 5 books of Moses, then there's the 12 books of history, and now we're getting into the 5 books of poetry. But it's not sequential. It's not chronological. It's going to be a little bit of a problem. But we'll try to take these and put them where they belong when we get to each book. So bless you guys. Let's have a good time going through the poetry books. Bless you. Love you. Let's keep moving through the scripture and see if we can get the whole picture, the whole story. Hey, bless you. Love you.